synapses. So this is an extremely complicated means of exchanging of information, and it needs to be complicated because we have a very intricate movement qualities. We're very complicated, and we need to have very precise and very complicated movement if we need it. So we have information that needs to be coordinated in a certain way that we get some type of motor output that we desire. A synapse is the connection between two neurons that we're going to talk about here. There may be thousands of connections between any two neurons. So they can connect to each other thousands of different ways. And it's still one motor neuron to one sensory neuron that has thousands of different means of exchanging information. So now at any one point, not all 1,000 has to be used. You could use 10 sending information. And that means something different than if you had sent 1,000. It means something different to the receiving neuron, to that motor neuron. It means something different, and you're going to get a different response from it, because it means something that's different. So there's tons of different connections, and what route the information comes in means something different to the motor neuron that's going to give some type of motor output. The proximity of the membranes of the two neurons, the proximity between the two, how close or how far that synaptic cleft is, that changes how long it takes for information to be exchanged. So it can slow down the rate of information exchange if the proximity between the two is really large, between the two membranes, or if there's lots of connector neurons between the two different, the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. There's a lot of connector neurons. It takes a longer amount of time to get the incoming information to the outgoing motor neuron. So it changes your rate of reaction. This has something to do with reaction time, how fast you can react to something. The more often a stimulus is used, the faster it becomes. So the more you use something, and this alludes to kind of like training and motor learning. You train, right, over and over and over and over, and eventually it gets faster. And you can just react faster, you can do the contraction faster, you can do that motor skill faster. The more you use some type of motor pathway, some certain sensory neurons to some certain motor neurons, the ones that are used over and over and over again get faster at exchanging information. The greater the number of the synapses from receptor to effector, the longer the time from stimulus to response. So what does that mean? The greater the number of synapses, connections, from receptor, meaning, let's say, the sensory neuron, to the motor neuron. So the more information, the more number of synapses that are being used between your sensory neuron to your motor neuron, the longer the time from the stimulus to the response. So the longer the reaction time. Now, why do you think that is? Why does processing time increase with the number of synapses? Processing time meaning your reaction time, your ability to react to something. You remember Hicks' law? Do you remember that a little bit? No, 250's gone. Remember Hick-Hyman law? The number of stimulus responses, like the number of stimuli to the number of responses output, increased your reaction time. Meaning, if you knew only one stimulus was coming in and you only had one way to respond, you could do it like that. But let's say you had to wait for 8. You had 8 possible places somebody could touch you, and that means you had 8 possible places you had to. Okay, there it went. You know what I mean? It increased the time. The same thing holds true here. If you have tons of information going into a motor neuron, it has to process it all. It has to process all of the information, then decide how to react. So the more information you have coming into the motor neuron, the slower it's going to be at reacting to it. That's stimulus response. That's what stimulus response means. Stimulus to response. Incoming information to your motor response. So, again, let's look at a synapse between two neurons. Not a synapse, not a neuromuscular synapse, not a motor neuron to a muscle synapse, but actually a sensory neuron to a motor neuron, or a sensory neuron to a connector neuron, just some type of two neuron connections. It's very, very similar to what we talked about before. But again, if you take physiology, you have to memorize this whole process. It's lovely, but you don't have to here. A synapse is just the transmission. So this is a sensory neuron where you have an action potential that's being propagated down the sensory neuron that's carrying some amount of information. Neurotransmitters are released. They go across the synaptic cleft. They are going to bind at the postsynaptic neuron. They bind there. Once they bind there, they release another set of chemical responses that then propagates this action potential down to keep it going. So it comes down here, chemical responses sent across here, binds here, continues the action potential down. That's a synapse. And you know what I mean by action potential, right? And then, right? Action potential, second heartbeat, goes down. Action potentials. How do they work? So, thresholds. There's a bar. You have to reach it for something to continue on. You have to reach some bar. Like you have to reach a C bar to pass this class, right? You have to meet some threshold to make it pass. Synapses have the same thing. An action potential needs to reach a certain level for it to keep sending the information down so you can keep moving on. So every motor neuron has to have some level of, a minimum level of stimulus or chemical transmitter, so some neurotransmitter. It has to reach a certain level to initiate or propagate the signal on. So that's a threshold. We have two different types of stimuli. We have facilitating stimuli and we have inhibiting stimuli. Sometimes we don't want this action potential to keep moving down. We want to stop it. That's an inhibiting type of response. Facilitatory means we want it to keep going. So it's an excitatory stimulus to get it excited to keep going. What this does is it lowers threshold levels. Now what does that mean? Why is it lowering and not highering it? You're probably right, I just can't hear you.
It takes less stimulus.
Exactly. Right, so if you lower the bar, it takes less to reach it, right? So if we lower the threshold level, that means less stimulus has to come in. It means the easier it is to propagate the signal down. If we lower the bar of what's expected, it's easier to keep going. So that's an excitatory. So we take this level and we lower it. So less stimulus has to come in for you to keep moving the signal down the chain. Now, an inhibitory stimulus or an inhibitory response is when we want to stop it. So what you do is you higher the threshold level. That means more has to come in, and hopefully more isn't coming in so that it's not propagated down. It stops it. So a stimulus may be from more than one neuron. So I have this motor neuron that has all these dendrites in it that are inside your spinal cord. And it could be connecting to hundreds of different sensory neurons. And some of these sensory neurons are sending it a facilitatory response, and some of it could be sending it an inhibitory response. It has to process all of that. And the one response that is more is how the threshold gets changed. And that's how you decide whether to keep going or not going. So that's why when we talked about before, the more the information that comes in, the slower you are to respond, because you have to figure out, the motor neuron has to figure out whether it's supposed to keep going or not. So it has to level out its inhibitory and its facilitatory levels, and then figure out which one is more, then decide to move on. If there's less information coming in, the easier it is for it to figure that out, and the faster the reaction occurs. The sum total of the excitatory and the inhibitory determine whether the postsynaptic neuron will produce an action potential. That's exactly what I just said in a little bit more jargon. Whether or not to decide to continue on the action potential based off of which one is winning. Is that okay? You guys get that? Am I explaining that all right? Okay. So, let's look at this in terms of motor units. All right, from Wallace, what's the definition of a motor unit? Come on, guys. Go back there. It was traumatic, but go. What's the motor unit? One motor neuron and all the
Muscle fibers,
it innervates. Remember that? Okay. That's the motor unit. One motor neuron, a single motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers, it innervates. So remember, one motor neuron could have thousands of terminating branches. So it can go to thousands of individual muscle cells. Remember we said each one of its terminating branches goes to a single muscle cell. So that motor unit can go to thousands of different, if it has 1,000 terminating branches, each one goes to 1,000 different muscle fiber cells. So there's a ratio that it can be. So this is looking at one motor neuron coming out and it innervating 4 muscle fiber cells. So it's a 1 to 4 ratio in this case. So that's a motor unit. So all muscle fibers in the motor unit are the same muscle fiber type. We have 3 different types. Remember we talked about slow twitch and fast twitch? And I said fast twitch will then later on be divided up into 2 different. There's a type 2A and a type 2B. So we have 3 different types. 1 fast twitch, 1 slow twitch, and 2 types of fast twitch. So all of the motor fibers in a certain motor unit are all of one of these 3 types. And this is important to understand a little bit later on in the next couple of slides. Hopefully we'll get through. So this is looking at it from slowest, less fatigue, down to fastest, quick to fatigue. Slow twitch fibers, just like we said before, they're slow to react. They have slow contraction times. They can generate little tension, but they're highly fatigue resistant. So these are our endurance muscles, like our posture muscles. Ones that are slow to contract, but can contract for a long amount of time. Distance runners. We have our fast twitch, which is type 2A. These are our first fast response type of muscles. These ones are a little less red, and they're a little smaller. But however, they have really quick reaction time. They can give you a quick amount of force, but only in a short amount of time. Versus these guys are similar, but they're even faster, and they can give even more force in an even less amount of time. So these guys respond very, very quickly. However, they're like our sprinters, a lot of force in a short amount of time. These are primarily going to be innervated by our alpha motor neurons, our big, large motor neurons, and that would make sense because these are our big, fast muscles that we want a lot of power from very quickly and then shut off. These are our motor neurons, our alpha motor neurons, sorry. slowest to fastest to respond. So there's an order to this in which we recruit. And so motor units have to be of one certain type, so that when we ask a motor neuron to send a stimulus, that we're getting one certain type of response, so that we can get a slow response or we can get a fast response. We don't get some weird combination of a response. Now, the size of these motor units, the size of how many of these certain types of muscle fibers that we have to this motor neuron, it varies. We can have something that's 1 to 2,000. One motor neuron, one single motor neuron, to 2,000 different muscle fiber cells. An example of that is gastroc. It has multiple motor neurons, but any one usually has about 2,000 different fibers that it innervates. Versus something like the eyeball. Could have 1 to 10. So what's the difference between these two in terms of motor skills? Large motor units are used for what type of movement?